just over the course of the last 9 months have been remarkable. And I attribute a lot of it to the shakeup that Donald Trump's brought to Washington, D.C. and our culture more broadly. The fact that you have major news corporations and media outlets changing their habits, not only in terms of replacing talent that may be out of touch with the American people, but also in some cases changing ownership and their editorial standards, I think is a good thing ultimately for the American people. I think that they are frustrated. You see that in poll after poll, that the American people don't trust the news media. And so if they weren't in the process of reforming and making changes, they'd really be tone deaf to what our country is going through right now. In today's day and age, anybody who has any name ID or has had a presence on one of these major broadcast or cable networks can turn to Substack or YouTube or any of these platforms and build their own audience. And so in some cases, I think you see journalists leaving because they don't necessarily want to comply with the corporate policies or the editorial direction that they're taking. I think in other cases, it's simply because the market is dictating that these news organizations have lost touch with their audience and they need to make changes to survive financially. And so it's a combination of those two things. Ultimately, I think it's good that the American people have more choices. The marketplace will ultimately decide if people like Don Lemon and Chuck Todd are successful in their independent ventures and can, really command the same audience that they once did on those big broadcast networks. Prior to the 1970s and the Watergate scandal, journalism was largely performed and conducted by blue-collar workers. They were people who lived among their neighbors in their communities and focused on the issues that they cared about and animated the people that they lived among. And what happened was there was a great interest in the journalism profession because of Watergate. And ultimately what you saw in the decades that followed were Ivy League institutions and other prestigious colleges that turned out pretty leftist or woke journalists who then went on to take jobs at these major corporations and in many cases leadership positions. And so that's why you've seen such bias against conservative ideas and conservative individuals. Obviously, President Trump being one of the most notable examples in that. And so this change that we had from a blue-collar force of journalists to a prestigious and elite class of journalists, I think has ultimately been one of the reasons why the American people and trust in media has declined so precipitously over the course of the last few decades. The only reason that conservatives are so successful when it comes to journalism and media today is because their forefathers in the conservative movement laid the groundwork. And I can't think of any better example of this than William F. Buckley at National Review. And you had people like Ed Fulner in the 1990s make investments in Town Hall. You had Richard Viguerie and obviously the great success that he had with direct mail. You had Rush Limbaugh, the broadcast titan in talk radio. And then you had people like Morton Blackwell, who really were devoted to training journalists and helping conservatives establish a strong presence in media. And so were it not for those people who decades ago had a vision for what an alternative to the legacy media would be, I don't think that we would necessarily be having the success today that organizations like the Daily Signal, ours, and so many others are achieving.